So one of the things you might wonder is, why is it that death evolved? It doesn't really make that much sense from a Darwinian perspective, right? Because you'd make the presupposition that if you could just stick around and father children, say, for 250 years, you'd be doing a lot better job than the poor sap who only lived to be 30. So why is it that you only live to be 70 and really your period of fertility is over, say, by the time you're 40? Why would that be? What's the utility of death? And then you remember, well, the environment's always changing, right, in this chaotic manner that's represented by the Great Mother. Can you change with it? And the answer to that is yes, but only to a certain point, which is why as people age, they tend to become more and more alienated from the current culture, right? They've adopted their position of being, say, which is more or less fixed by the time they're 25 or so, once their prefrontal cortex matures, and then after that the world gets away from them. They don't have enough biological resources left to constantly undergo new revolutionary neurological processes. And part of the reason is this: you have more neural connections in your brain when you're first born than you do for the rest of your life, any other time in your life. And as you learn, when you're an infant, and as you learn, say, over the first 2 years, what happens is that there's a plenitude of circuits, and they die off, leaving only those circuits that have a function. And you think about that, it's kind of a quasi-Darwinian process. And so what that means is that as you mature and become fixed in your form, to adopt your personality, whatever it becomes, what's happening is that the excess possibility, in some sense, is being demolished by experience. So the tyrannical aspect of enculturation is something that's real, because it makes you, in large part, what you are. And you have to understand as well that that's necessary, because it's better to be something in the final analysis. It's better to be something than to be nothing. But, we still have residual dreams like those expressed by Peter Pan, say, who's the boy that never wants to grow up because he doesn't want to attain any final and fixed form. And it's interesting because in one respect, as you progress through your life, you're climbing, assuming things are going well, you're climbing to ever new heights. But on the other hand, the direction that you're going in constantly narrows as you age. So there's a real trade-off there, and I think the existential angst that's caused as a consequence of that trade-off is often real. And I also think that adolescents and early adults feel this most intently, which is part of the reason why they tend to rebel against social structures in general, whether it's the military-industrial complex or the corporate world or globalization or what have you, is that you have these large structures that represent the tyrannical aspect of social being. And it's no wonder that the fact of those structures engenders rebellion. It should. On the other hand, it's also no wonder that structures like that exist, because if they didn't exist, then people would have no way of interrelating their social being, and we would revert back to the sort of Hobbesian state of war where everybody's arms are around everybody else's throat. That doesn't mean the payoff is always good. So, for the Freudians, of course, had a real field day with this, and were most fundamentally concerned by it. Now, part of the reason that Freudian psychology has had such an immense impact on Western and world culture is because Freud came along just when classical Judeo-Christian mythological structures were on a serious decline in the West. And Freud stepped in with a secularized mythological version of reality, which said, well, there's nature, and that's the id, right? That's the wild and untamed impulses that spring up from the animal mind. And there's the ego, which is the individual, who's in many ways a pawn of these id-like forces. And then on top of the ego, crushing it down into the id, so to speak, is the superego, which is the internal and external embodiment of social order and morality. So you can see the mythological substructure underlying Freud. Freud said, well, the ego is always being shaped by the superego, and it's always compulsion. It's don't. It's always no. It's like Old Testament morality, right, in the incarnation of the 10 Commandments. Whatever you want to do, if it feels good, the probability is high that it's immoral from the perspective of the social world. And you can really see this with children, It's really remarkable to watch them, because my sense is, and I don't think this is just because I'm a particularly tyrannical father, is that children often get in more trouble for having fun than they do for any other reason, because their capacity for unbridled enjoyment is so unbridled that it actually poses a threat to orderly structures. So, you know, if a child really gets in an active mood and is playing a very active game, I mean, especially if they're somewhere between, say, 3 and 5, they can tear your house to shreds in no time flat, and you're always following them around going, no, 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 quiet down, don't do that. And you know, they're smiling away and they're happier than any adult you're ever going to see in your entire life, and you're doing everything you can to push them down so that they can sit quietly and read a book or whatever it is you think they should be doing. And that's really nasty and horrible, but by the same token, it's absolutely necessary, because if they don't learn to bring their impulses, even their impulses, their ludic impulses, right, their impulses to play, under control, then nobody else can stand them. And if they don't get access to the resources that are in the social world, man, they have one dismal life laid out in front of them. So anyway, so that's an early description of the genesis of the conflict, say, between the ego and the superego. And I just wanted to point that out, because it's not just sex and aggression that gets regulated, right? I mean, we can understand why that might happen. But it's also playfulness and creativity and spontaneity and all the things that we associated with the joy of being that the terrible, tyrannical social structure puts a clamp on. So Jack Panksepp, for example, has recently demonstrated that children, boys, because it's usually boys, who have attention deficit disorder, which is generally diagnosed in the schoolroom, do much better if they're placed on methylphenidate, which is a kind of amphetamine, fundamentally. But normal kids do better on amphetamines too, by the way. They can focus more, and they can pay attention more. Mostly what methylphenidate does is suppress play. So Panksepp's notion is that, well, what's happening with these ADHD kids, hyperactive kids, is they're more playful, more boisterously playful, which tends to be a masculine attribute in the juvenile forms of many mammals. They're boisterously playful. Give them a little methylphenidate, that shuts down their play behavior, and they can sit down and focus, you know. And, well, you can understand how, even if you might think that's necessary, because apparently many people do, you can also still understand that by the same token, that probably represents some kind of loss, right? Because we like to see kids play, and it's good for them besides. So, anyways, Freud says the ego pops up, it's all thrilled to death with the world, the superego comes along and shuts it down, and that's a fate that befalls all of us. And not only that, because Freud's a pretty wise man, all things considered, he doesn't say that's all to the bad, he says that's the price we pay for social being, and fair enough.